to dive a little more deeply into the topic of validity. And in this video, I'm going to block off a misconception of both validity and truth. Okay, so first of all, it's nice to just have it's an argument on the board. So here's a familiar one. All men are mortal. Premise 2. Socrates was a man. Conclusion, Socrates was mortal. Okay, it's one of our most common well-known arguments. Now this argument is valid. Okay, and why is it valid? Remind yourself of the definition. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Okay, try to get that into your head. Just kind of, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Okay, get that into your head. That's what it is for an argument to be valid. And so one thing I want to draw from this is validity is a property of arguments. Okay. Validity is a property of arguments. Okay. Now we can ask this question: is this argument true? Okay. Now, when you think about that, you should think to yourself, actually, it's not the argument that's true, it's the individual premises or the conclusion that are true. So it's true that all men are mortal, it's true that Socrates was a man, and it's true that Socrates was mortal. So there's three truths here. Okay, it's not just one argument that's true. It's like three truths. Three different claims are each individually true. Okay, so the way I put it is each of these premises and the conclusion is a proposition. Okay, so I'll say this. Truth is a property of propositions. Where propositions could be premises or conclusions. All right. Now, with that said, I'm going to state two claims to clarify something, and this will help us block off the misconception or the false thing that a lot of students say. Okay. Some students will say something, and here's the opposite of it, and I'll tell you what the students say. So here's the thing you should know. Premises and conclusions, okay, are not valid or invalid. Okay, premises and conclusions are not valid or invalid. Why? Because it's not an individual premise or an individual conclusion that's valid. As we said, validity is a property of argument, so it has to be the argument as a whole that's valid or invalid. But we don't want to say a premise or conclusion or even a proposition. So premises, conclusions, propositions, they are not valid or invalid. Okay, that doesn't make sense. Okay, similarly, arguments are not true or false. Okay, it doesn't make sense to say this whole argument is true or false. Don't say arguments are true or false. No, this argument is false. Instead, we should say premise 1 or premise 2 is true or false, or we can say the conclusion is true or false. But the argument as a whole isn't true or false. The argument as a whole is going to be valid or invalid. Okay, so these are the things you should know. Validity is a property of arguments. Truth is a property of propositions. Premises and conclusions are not valid or invalid. Arguments are not true or false. And the incorrect thing students often say is when they say, oh, that argument's true. Okay, that doesn't make sense. Or when they say, that's a valid premise, doesn't make sense. Okay, maybe the word valid or the word true in ordinary English could be loose enough to apply to those things, But remember, we're talking about deductive validity, okay? And so that's something very specific about the word valid. We're using the word valid in a very specific way. All right, so with that, we'll move on.